Good afternoon, everybody, or walawani, a new term I use. It's a greeting or a farewell, expressing hope for a safe journey, whether someone is arriving or departing. And it's in Durga language on the south coast of New South Wales. And it means we hope you have a safe journey home or a safe journey here. And this concept of safe journey is, reflecting the deep respect for land and in interconnection of people and place. And of course, we are all today on Indigenous country. So I would like to acknowledge that we pay our respects to all elders, past and present, and that this sort of conversation really brings together how do we in the built environment community respect culture, country, bring in biodiversity and circularity as part of our decarbonisation journey, but as part of our ongoing respect for country. And as part of that acknowledgement, I did want to kind of read a poem, kind of get us into thinking about why sort of understanding language is really important. And it's from a book, Words to Sing the World Alive. And as I kind of skill myself up in being a better custodian of country and supporter of the work that we do within MECLA in trying to bring these things together, I thought it would be good to share it with you. So this, each word becomes a singing, the words reclaiming our physical beings as well as our spiritual and cultural selves. We are reminded that there is also a language of the tides, language of animals, the language of plant cycles, and the language of the night. So this particular poem is using the word Widjawa. I miss the country. I can barely stand still. I keep moving house because it's never home. I've moved my home around, my room around, but it's never finished. I stand underneath the only gum tree on the street where I live, few doors down in the park for apartment dwellers. Big, hundreds of years old, I reckon. I circle round and hum Uncle Archie. So bow your head, old eucalyptus and wattle tree, while the cities and the parks that they have planned look out of place because the spirit's in the land. It's time I go home. Every time I'm back here, I catch a cold. Maybe the city's leaving my body. Mum says it's in the air. Sometimes I feel like leaving my body. There's a fallen red gum blocking the driveway, and I remember bial, red gum, unga to fall. We'd use it to stay warm. I stand on the back step to breathe, the way the air smells and the trees sound, and the way the mountains feel like company, big personality. We talk a little, but not out loud. Spoke to my auntie on the phone last night. She apologised for talking too much. I say never stop. I'm in the far paddock and hear Mum chopping the wood. I think my dad lived and died near the mountains, and maybe I will too. Wudjera, to return, to come home. And I guess as we in the built environment, become more immersed in the whole nature positive, biodiversity, circularity conversation, it is a calling for us to return back to country, to be thinking about that we are one with nature, we're not separate to it, and it's a journey that we're on and that we are going to sort of take our part through today. So with that, I would like to invite our first speaker, please, to share her slides. So we've got just a bit of an agenda today. So we've got 4 presenters. They'll speak for somewhere between 7 and 10 minutes. And then we've got we'll open it up to panelists, and that's where you can have an opportunity to put your Q&A questions that you have in the Q&A button, and you can chat away as well. So Megan Shallard, you've finished your Master's Capstone program at the University of Sydney, and we're delighted to be able to launch this report today, which was a labour of love. So over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Monica, and for that amazing welcome to country. It was really lovely to hear that. I would also like to say my own as well, please. So I'd like to acknowledge that I am presenting to you today from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to the elders past and present and recognise their enduring connection to this place that I call home. I would also like to thank MECLA as well as WWF Australia and, of course, the Sydney Environment Institute for co-publishing our final report, which has the same title as this presentation and which I'll be talking about today. And lastly, but not least, a very big thank you to my two co-authors, Joshua Bishop and Aisha Tulloch, both of who are available for the panel in this chat today. And thank you so much for your contributions to our work. It has made all the difference to me. My name is Megan Charlotte, as Monica has already said. And without further ado, I will move on to my show. So this all began as a capstone research project for my Masters of Sustainability at the University of Sydney. And we aim to look at the relationship between the built environment and biodiversity. No small task. And then over the past 4 years, we've continued to develop that, which has now resulted in a very comprehensive report consisting of 7 chapters and including over 400 references. As our project aimed to investigate the relationship between the built environment and biodiversity, we began with a few broad questions examining the built environment's impacts on biodiversity, considering where the most harmful impacts occur along the building life cycle, the current mitigation efforts, and how buildings might become better for biodiversity. So answering these questions required us to look at the problem of biodiversity decline and the main drivers of that decline, as well as some background as to why biodiversity is so important in the first place. This is what we cover in Chapter 2 predominantly. Then in Chapter 3, we consider the built environment's role in that decline from an environmental impacts perspective, including both direct and indirect impacts throughout the building life cycle, at the building site and beyond. So to be able to reconcile the cause of those impacts, we looked at the building life cycle as a framework for understanding how they might occur over time, so that we can investigate what interventions could be made and applied to address those impacts. It's not surprising that impacts occur at every stage, whether through natural resource extraction and depletion, land use change, or pollution. And investigating all of these impacts at the various stages from a high level proved both challenging and very time-consuming, because most quantifiable data related to buildings is concentrated in the construction stage for good reason, and very little information is available which covers the more what we call indirect impacts, such as those occurring during occupancy and throughout the supply chain, both up and downstream. This schematic, as overwhelming as it first appears, is an example of how we try to map those direct and indirect impacts to biodiversity, using the drivers of biodiversity loss as a framework horizontally across the green top line. We have the drivers of biodiversity loss, and then dropping down vertically is the building life cycle. And as you can see, even now in its most simplest form, it is still evident how complex that subject matter is. That brings us to Chapter 4, where we look at the various approaches to environmental impact avoidance, mitigation, and restoration through the mitigation hierarchy, then to how they can be applied at the city, urban, and building scales of the built environment. And from there, with our focus on buildings, we looked into the various regulatory and voluntary mechanisms that exist in Australia and abroad, which can help to define and guide green building approaches to address those impacts. Part of Chapter 4 includes an example of how one might break down the steps of the mitigation hierarchy to address each driver of biodiversity loss through specific actions or decisions for each stage of the building's life cycle. In this case, we use the construction stage as a way to test the framework. For example, if you look at minimizing the use of virgin materials by using salvaged or recycled materials, this would be a way to address habitat destruction that might otherwise occur from logging trees for timber. In Chapter 5, we talk about findings from interviews that we had with 26 built environment stakeholders on the topic of sustainability, biodiversity conservation, and also voluntary rating schemes. We then identified what were discussed as the main barriers and enablers to improving sustainability in the building industry, and then classified these responses according to 7 themes, which is what you see in front of you. Then, considering some of the key barriers, we use this information to help us determine what sustainable and nature-positive solutions might look like for the built environment moving forward, which is what we do in Chapter 6. So here we explore how regenerative design, if approached through a systems thinking perspective and rooted in an understanding of the diverse values of nature, as well as implemented and delivered by transdisciplinary project teams and invited with stakeholders, can go a long way to improve to producing nature-positive outcomes for buildings, so long as those barriers to progress are also being addressed at the same time. Also in Chapter 6, we briefly discuss 4 case studies, which we highlight as examples of built environments that go beyond doing less harm and which show the potential of regenerative design. So this slide is based on the Paddock Eco Village in Castlemaine, Victoria. It includes, oh my goodness, sorry, how do I go back? It includes 27 dwellings arranged around a stepped productive gardens. The project was registered with the Living Building Challenge, which also helped to define their sustainable and regenerative features. It demonstrates whole systems thinking by integrating housing, food production, and community systems, as well as adopts a place-based approach and with the local community and ecology. The paddock emphasizes local food production and resource recycling, which also aligns with circular economy principles. And importantly, it fosters coevolution through symbiotic relationship, between residents and the local ecosystem. Then in our final chapter, Chapter 7, we offer 27 recommendations with specific suggestions for action according to 5 categories. So, for example, if we take number 23, under foster a nature-positive culture, questioning assumptions and outdated harmful practices might look like critically examining business as usual approaches, building a better understanding of systemic impacts, and partnering with traditional owners to understand local ecological systems for specific project sites. That brings me to the end of my presentation. I know it's been a whirlwind due to the time constraints, but if anything I've spoken about has sparked you, I do encourage you to read our report, which will be available for download, I believe, on the MECLA website, which includes, of course, our list of 400 references and also appendices that explain our methods. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to me, Josh, my co-author, and Aisha directly. And thank you so much for hearing me out, and I really look forward to the panel discussion coming up next. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Megan. Lovely. Wonderful to see that this report has come to this point in time. And so now I'm going to hand it over to our second presenter, Lisa McLean, who's the CEO of Circular Australia, to really sort of dive deeper into that work. And just so people are aware, we will be sharing links to the reports, all of the reports, when they're available. And Lisa, I'll put a copy of the latest report in the chat as well while you presented. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica, and thank you also for your wonderful acknowledgement of country as well. And Megan, I really enjoyed that report. I'm also going to quickly pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge, you know, the incredible role our traditional First Nations people have played in terms of being custodians and practitioners of circularity for millennia. And I'd like to say Bajari Gamarua, which is hello to all of you, in Gadigal language from the Eora Nation. So Circular Australia's latest report touches on some of these themes that Megan's talked about, but we wanted to look at a document for policymakers. This report was funded by our National Circular Economy Council, which is Queensland Government, New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia. And we wanted to understand how can we actually now roll up our sleeves and apply circularity in the way it's meant to be applied, which is right across the economy. It's a framework. It's not a means to an end like net zero is. It's a framework through which we can achieve these critical issues, the triple planetary crises. And we've really got to be able to understand climate in relation to circularity. We have to understand the impact of consumption and hyperconsumption. We have to talk about it. We have to understand that technomass is growing, biomass is shrinking. We can't keep using and throwing away, and recycling isn't enough. So how do we actually integrate circularity with biodiversity and climate? And that's what this research looks at. It looks at the intersections between these really important agendas, global agendas. And it looks at the synergies and the gaps and those opportunities to integrate policy and provides some key considerations for policymakers. If we look at the benefits of integration for biodiversity and circularity, we see that there's some really positive outcomes. We can reduce land, by reducing land use, we can design out waste and pollution, we can enhance biodiversity and nature conservation in areas that are used for production, make them more effective and efficient. We know that globally our food systems and the built environment, of course, is a really big category here, along with forestry, plastics, packaging, and textiles. These sectors have enormous opportunities to limit biodiversity losses, and so does Australia's agriculture and mining sectors. And we have to keep remembering that we produce all this stuff, but 90% of it we waste. It's either landfilled, burnt, or it's outside our reach. We can't access those infrastructural products or things. So our economic processes in this linear economy are incredibly inefficient, and they're unsustainable, and they have to come to an end. So thinking about how we can integrate circularity is really important. The next aspect here is integrating waste pollution with circularity. So again, we've got the hierarchy, and I note, Megan, your hierarchy, I can't wait to have a deeper look at that. It's really important we see that circularity practices fall into this hierarchy. I mentioned before, we can't recycle our way out of everything. So we have to look at those things up that hierarchy that we can do to improve efficiencies, still get what we need, still create jobs and industries, but by designing out waste and pollution. So rethinking how we design and manufacture is really important, and use these materials. We need to also look at that resource to increase efficiency, resource and product efficiency, and get rid of all the toxic things. We've got to be designing things to last for longevity. They have to be able to be repaired. They have with IP to actually repair it available, and also it has to be able to be broken down at end of life so that we can clean stream those resources and get them going. The refusing and avoidance strategies are also going to be very, very important, and this also can enhance innovation. We've seen as a service business models emerge out of these refusal and avoidance strategies. Companies like Caterpillar have been, since the 70s, taking back all their infrastructure and equipment, breaking it down like Lego and sending it back out into the market. So there's enormous benefits for the consumer to lower price point and to increase the revenue off those products, taking these avoidance strategies and changing sourcing and business models. And then, of course, higher value resource recovery is also super important, supporting the infrastructure that we're going to need to recycle materials and to upcycle them, to create safe places to store and process and activate these new business models. Now, if we move on to the other aspect, climate change and circularity, we know that circular economy can address climate change by driving reduction in that demand for virgin materials in the ways I've just mentioned, but also supporting the renewable energy transition. If you think about a solar panel, it's going to be effective in reducing carbon in that renewable energy context. However, if it micro cracks and gets landfilled and can't be repaired and the value can't be extracted from it, it's undone the carbon that it's cut. So we have to be looking at embodied carbon in this aspect. We have to take a systems approach, particularly in the renewable energy transition, and thinking about the markets for secondary critical minerals that we can get out of those resources to get into renewable energy components, whether they're wind farms or solar. What are we going to do with our batteries and black mass to make sure that we don't lose that opportunity? In Australia, that's the loss of lithium, for example, in batteries is a $3 billion economic opportunity for Australia. Then we looked at these principles that can be applied in order to make this integration policy approach work within policy settings. So systems thinking, the number one. Social dimensions is something that emerged out of our research here. Very important. How do we actually think about behavior and ensure that people can still participate in this circular economy and they're not disadvantaged in it? Consumption reduction, we have to start talking about policies that don't overuse our resources, that remove this emphasis on hyperconsumption. How can we think about that? Regenerative agriculture is going to play a big role. We talked about nature positive and net zero linkages, and also those high value resources. How do we recover them in a way that's going to be efficient and enable us to activate new industries? Social dimensions, this is a really important thing. We haven't talked a lot about it in the transition, circular economy transition. So we've got to understand, and often it has been overlooked because we're focused on that techno-economic transition. It's really important we start to think about those social dimensions and those big barriers to that take-up as social acceptance, the new practices we need to develop. And I talked about as a service business models. Do we always need to own something and own the residual value of that asset? Can we not use it in a different way, still get what we need? And how do we develop awareness and know-how, new business models, etc.? The social dimensions are also really important in engaging with our First Nations peoples, acknowledging their key practices that have sustained Australia and made it a productive environment for millennia. And other things to think about: affordability, access to information, and also to ensure we're not worsening inequities through circularity. Consumption reduction is absolutely critical. We need to start looking at these trade-offs when integrating these agendas. So I talked about before energy, the needing for recycling, refurbishing and transporting, that energy that's required for those practices. How do we mitigate it and think more in a systems way through reverse logistics and other things? Renewable energy requires more resources. We've got to think about where we get them from. Hence, the secondary markets are very important. And then thinking about reducing material consumption, it's absolutely essential we start to do that across supply chains. For you to all be thinking about that, how can you operationalize this? What partnerships can you come up with your supply chains? And where are the opportunities to embrace new business models, potentially as a service? And of course, those high impact sectors, we know that the built environment is very critical in this. Sharing models, we're even hearing about facades as a service. We know there's lighting as a service, mobility as a service. Delft University is looking at commercializing facades of buildings as a service that can be broken down, come with all their insurances, the right materials, can be broken down if that building is removed eventually. Systems thinking, it's at the heart of everything. We really need to be looking at this, particularly at the negative impacts on nature and society, around the bioeconomy and land use. How can we think better in a broader way and the systems impacts and that decision making based on life cycle impacts through the supply chain, not just as a resource passes through a business model or a sector. We have to look at those resources through their whole life cycle. And then, of course, in the built environment, that's about prioritizing demand reduction, and lifetime extension, material recovery and recycling. And in this case, we are talking about infrastructure as well. We know there's bridge libraries or banks in Europe where you can actually go and get a disused bridge that's waiting there to be deployed. How can we start to think about that in Australia? Net zero, nature positive and net zero. We've got all this momentum now for finance. How do we actually align these goals and strategies to operationalize circularity? And the key principles here is, of course, are systems thinking, social considerations, a reduction in consumption, that holistic approach to regenerative agriculture. But we do need investment. We need finances and investors to be looking at how they can understand and scale up circular business models. And Circular Australia's got a report coming soon on this. It's a transition guide for investors in the finance sector on how they can do this. Innovation is also critical. Material sciences and technological improvements that can help us achieve this scale up of infrastructure and the things we need. We know regenerative agriculture is absolutely critical. You can see the percentage here. It's a 49% reduction in emissions from food and agricultural sector if we can apply circularity and think about these regenerative practices in agriculture. No tilling of soils or reduced tilling of soils, covering crops, rotational grazing, agroforestry, some really good ideas here. And also improving the soil quality and water quality is absolutely critical, and getting rid of all those chemicals which are really bad for the environment. There's a piece here also I'd like you to look at through the report around high-value resource recovery. Circular Australia has also done some studies here. We looked at 5 key resources: lithium, PET plastics, green steel, low-carbon cement, and textiles. Big opportunities here. We can't recycle our way out of everything, but we do need to extract value to build these markets in Australia. We've got some recommendations as well, Monica. You know, it is about resource sufficiency strategies and thinking about how you all can apply them officially in your ESG policies to get that net reduction in demand for virgin and fossil materials, aligning those goals of decarbonisation with nature positive, ensuring that you've got circular economy right across your hierarchy, but start to think about the social dimensions as well. How can we utilise and share infrastructure and enhance urban mining through the built environment? Lots of opportunities in supply chains there. And of course, more on integrating biodiversity, which we heard from Megan on here, and getting regenerative agriculture going. So I think that's enough from me. Now, Monica, and I'll hand back to you. I'm happy to take questions later.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Lisa. I mean, there's a lot to digest there. I put a copy of your latest report into the chat, and we'll circulate it as part of our ongoing work. So, you know, now that we've had sort of 2 reports with some kind of high-level concepts and some recommendations, we're now going to do a deeper dive into some more specific ideas. So I'd like to welcome Rory Hunter, founder, CEO of The Model, and you're going to share with us really, you know, a couple of case studies about the work that you've been doing, the build to rent place, adaptive reuse, you know, how does it stack up from both a sustainability, you know, biodiversity, decarbonisation point of view, but how does it also stack up as a good model that investors would be attracted to? So Rory, if you want to put your camera on, that would be great.
It seems to be blocked. Maybe Alexi can sort it.
You did pop up earlier. There you are. All right.
Okay.
And if you want to share, I don't know whether you can share it a little bit bigger than.
Yeah, is that screen sharing now?
Well, it's the PDF, isn't it, that you're sharing there?
Yeah, that's right. So
it's not perfect. It's only in the PDF rather than in the PowerPoint slide.
All right. Well, so lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So Model is a build to rent platform based down here in Melbourne. We have about $500 million worth of projects in the pipeline. And the starting point for us was really simple. Was a simple question. And ultimately, we have these 3 concurrent crises, a climate crisis, a housing crisis, and a mental health crisis. And so the question we asked ourselves was, can the built form help address all 3? And so that led to a 12-month deep dive into really looking at who the leaders in every aspect of the supply chain in development and really what were they doing and how were they leading this change. And so that included the likes of the Green Building Council of Australia, Clean Energy Finance Corporation, builders like Multiplex, And ultimately, we took all of their insights and then synthesized that into a white paper called Tomorrow's Too Late. And that really outlines a whole systems approach for how we can lead the decarbonisation of the built form while delivering housing at scale. And when we think about housing, historically, it's always been through the lens of cost. And so that's created these really perverse incentive structures and where the quality of the built form is often really compromised because of the short-term return objectives for the developer. But where build to rent is really quite revolutionary is that you've got a long-term owner of the entire asset. And so if you map out all those different stakeholders, from investors to residents to the environment to the community, you can weave all of those together to make sure that at a starting point, you're aligned. And when you start to do that, you can really look at a building through a very different lens, and it's a lens of value rather than cost.
So Rory, just excuse me, are you moving the slides, or are you still on your first slide?
Yeah, I'm moving through the slides.
Oh, because we can't see that actually.
Right.
We can only see your first slide.
Okay, bear with me. Okay, can you see that now?
That's better.
Okay. So ultimately, what we're designing and building for is a very different future. And so if you think about the four kind of key changes that are going to take place in the next decades or two, you've got four buckets. So at a regulatory level, now that we've legislated our 2030 targets and made commitments to net zero, the policy levers are going to increasingly be pulled, and the regulations on buildings are going to become increasingly stringent. Obviously, we're designing for a very different climate, a hotter climate, a more uncertain climate. At a customer level, renting is becoming something that is going to be a lot more long-term. And ultimately, people will be looking to live in values-based communities in places where they grew up, but maybe not necessarily can afford to own a home, but still need that same sense of safety and security in their tenure. And then the fourth piece is around capital allocation. And so both on the debt and the equity side, capital allocators are increasingly making commitments to net zero. And so they're really looking for projects that can deliver on that. And so when you think about it from that perspective, ultimately, by investing that money up front and creating a more resilient asset, you're mitigating all of that future risk, which means that ultimately you're able to drive a higher return. And so the thinking historically has always been, well, if it's sustainable, it's too expensive and it's going to come at the cost of our returns. And our whole thesis is that we think it's the opposite. By investing up front and looking at a project through that lens of value and mitigating that future risk, you can actually drive alpha. And so we're in the very final stages of producing a report with Jones Lang LaSalle, which really looks at similar assets globally. So places like Finland, Sweden, Germany, where you've got these sort of global examples of mass timber, passive house certified buildings, to really understand how they perform and how they outperform through rental premiums, reductions in energy, faster lease ups, greater retention, and cap rate compressions. And when you add all of that into an underwrite, ultimately it delivers a higher return. And so that's something that's really quite revolutionary from a development standpoint in Australia. And so we're really excited to release that report. And I thought I'd just give a quick example of one of our projects, which is an adaptive reuse of the old Schweppes cordial factory. So it's based in Abbotsford. And so we're basically turning that into a real global exemplar of sustainable housing. And so it will be Australia's first passive house certified apartment building, completely net zero in operations. It's all mass timber construction, 6-star Green Star with 50% reduction in embodied carbon and 9-star Nat Hers. And so the approach to how we design this is really quite different. It's about pulling in all of the key stakeholders from the very beginning, rather than just letting the architects sort of put pen to paper. It's about getting the ESD consultants, the structure and timber consultants, and really having an integrated design approach, because what we're designing here has never been done before in Australia. And so while it's quite a complex task, there are plenty of global examples for us to draw on. And so we're really excited to be able to bring it to life. Because ultimately the buildings that we're building now will be in existence for the next 50 to 100 years. And the biggest risk when we're developing is that the asset becomes stranded, nobody wants to live there, and nobody wants to own it. And so when you start thinking about what the value of that building will be like in 10, 20, 30 years, all of a sudden the business case to invest up front and create these deeply sustainable assets not only becomes sensible, but it becomes the best way to align investor returns with what's best for the community, what's best for the people that will ultimately be living in these assets, and to be able to create a whole business model around decarbonising the built form.
Thank you, Rory. That's excellent to hear those examples as well. So we're going to move from you now to Simon Dories, the CEO of Responsible Wood, to do a deeper dive into timber waste, which we know is pretty significant in Australia. And you presented this, Simon, to the Engineered Timber Working Group last year, and I was thought, oh, goodness, there's an opportunity to turn what we consider waste to be a resource for use in the built environment. So over to you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Monica, and good afternoon, everybody. Next slide, please. So I just quickly want to touch on a few challenges and opportunities in the timber forest product space. One of the, we talk about a climate crisis, and that is absolutely the case. In Australia at the moment, we have, I would be verging to say, a wood supply crisis. We think of plantation forestry as being very, very positive, which it is. But there's a couple of graphs here. Both the softwood plantation estate and the hardwood plantation estate, if you look at the trend lines, they've actually declined very, very quickly. So in a situation where wood demand increases as population increases, but conversely, at the same time, the amount of plantation wood we have from sustainable sources is actually declining. So that's not a good place to be. We think of Australia as this, this huge country with lots and lots of land, lots of plantations. Actually not the case. It's shrinking. Next slide, please. Okay, and also the volume of high quality hardwoods is also declining. So again, you put that together, it's not a particularly positive story. Next slide, please. Okay, so what does it mean? With increasing demand and less domestic supply, it invariably ends to a massive growth in imports. So this is a graph. It's probably a couple of years old now, but you can see the trends there. But right at the moment, we are importing about 400,000 cubic metres of softwood framing, which is about a third of the total market. And we're importing about 400,000 cubic metres of engineered wood products, which is plywood and LVL, and that's probably about 65, 2/3 of the market. What drives that? In part, it's economics, but ultimately it comes down to domestic wood supply. And so it's not a good and it's not a positive story. Next slide, please. And just to stress it, from yesterday's Timber and Forest e-news, there's a little story that says that hardwood imports from the USA to Australia increased by 86% in 12 months. Which is absolutely massive. So you sort of get the picture. So next slide. So the question is, going into the future, where are we going to get our wood from? So we can start new plantations today, which would be a very, very good idea. But again, to put a plantation in, you're looking at about between 30, if it's a softwood species, or 80 years until you can harvest the wood, which is a long time. We can increase imports. Look, we can do that in the short term, but in the longer term, is it really sustainable? And also there's some questionable sources. Not all wood comes from a well-managed forest. There is still wood coming into Australia that's the result of deforestation. And also, within a few years, there is going to be a global shortage of wood, which, and again, if we don't have a domestic supply of some sort, puts our building sector in quite a precarious position. And new and innovative products. Look, absolutely, that will help. But is it enough to make up the shortfall? And the last option is the circular economy. And in my opinion, it's probably the best bet. And I'll just share a couple of case studies of products where there's some real potential. So next slide, please. Okay, so some statistics. Right at the moment, there is about 1.8 million tonnes of waste wood, and that's demolition waste. It is waste from industry. It is household waste going into landfill, which is about 3 million cubic metres. We import roughly 800,000 cubic metres of wood. So the real challenge and the real question, would it be possible to mobilise about 25% of our waste wood, develop a range of innovative circular economy products, and actually become self-sufficient in structural wood supply, which would be an amazing and an incredible outcome. And I think something for the future of our country, we need to start getting our mind into this space. Next slide. Okay, so just a couple of examples. So what's being done now in the circular economy space? There's a company called D&A Henderson in Benalla, in Victoria. They've got a stewardship program in place where they will take waste. They manufacture particle board. They will take waste particle board back from the shop fitters, the joiners. They will also take pallet waste, waste back from the truss and frame sector, and they will then remanufacture that into new particle board. So roughly about 75% of the input material now comes from post-consumer source or post-consumer or waste products, which is an amazing story. And the really interesting thing is the economics. Whereas they would be paying for wood directly from the forest, because this is waste materials and there's a cost to dispose of it, they actually get paid for taking other people's wood waste. So not only a good sustainability outcome, it actually is helps with the economics significantly as well. Next slide, please. Okay, recycling of large timber structures. So, I think our great-grandfathers or great-grandparents were, look, you could maybe argue that they didn't understand the value of timber, but really at the same time, it was probably the resource that they had. So recycling of large timber structures, there's lots of bridges, lots of large industrial buildings that are now coming beyond their useful life. And there's real opportunity to recycle those timbers. And in those old bridges, in those old structures, there is an amazing amount of very high quality and very valuable timber. Next slide. So that's just an example there. Look at the flooring there on the left-hand side. That is 100% recycled from old buildings, old bridges, but also telephone poles as well, or telephone and electricity poles. So again, another really good example of the circular economy in practice. Next slide. Okay, but what do we really need? The shortage is not so much in the decorative appearance grade products, even though there is a shortage, but it is in structural grade products for home construction. What I have here is a photo of a product that was called Scrimba. I saw a few familiar faces from the timber sector in the meeting before. We say don't mention the S word. This was a product that was developed by CSIRO in the 1980s. using low-grade timber or even potentially timber waste. You mash it up, you manufacture it into a scrim, you apply adhesive, and then you form structural beams out of it. This is how clever our country is sometimes. We do something really innovative, world-leading. Industry doesn't pick it up immediately, so then we go and we sell the intellectual property off overseas. They develop the products and get the benefit of it, and that's actually what happened in this case here. But again, this particular product, just as an example, diverting wood waste through a scrimming process and remanufacturing a structural product that could go into housing, that would help alleviate the wood shortage problem, to reduce imports, but also create a domestic industry and support Australian jobs and a sustainable economy as well. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I mentioned scrim, but you can even make it from garden waste. So you imagine if there was a council tip, for example, where there's large volumes of demolition waste or household waste timber plus garden waste, you could actually combine the two and produce a very sustainable product. It is technology that's available now. Obviously, there's a bit of work around the economics, but in a wood-constrained world, which we're going to be in within maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years, it's one of those options which to me is quite low-hanging fruit. Next slide. Okay, rubber wood waste particle board. This is like a really interesting product. There's been a research project done in conjunction with the Tyre Stewardship Council and the Queensland Department of Primary Industries on combining waste tyre rubber with wood to manufacture particle board. And so it's been trialled up to 30% waste tyre content. But what's the results? Basically, by combining waste tyre rubber with wood fibre in manufacturing particle board, you actually end up with a much better and superior particle board. So it has improved thickness swelling. It meets the Australian standards without the use of waxes and resins, which means that the waste rubber displaces petrochemical-based products. So there's a good climate mitigation benefit there. It has improved water resistance, so it's more durable. It has much better screw holding properties, which for cabinetry is one of those critical properties you need to ensure that it's fit for purpose. It's a little bit less stiff than particle board manufactured solely from wood fibre. But again, for kitchen, bathroom furniture, kitchen cabinetry, bathroom furniture and high humidities, it's actually a much superior product. There's a little bit of work being done at the moment around just investigating what an EPD would look like. Now, interesting enough, so this was 30% tyre rubber. If all particle board manufactured in Australia used 30% waste tyre rubber, we would consume every single waste tyre in Australia and have to start importing waste tyre rubber to make up the difference, which is really interesting. So again, really interesting opportunity, and it can use existing technology. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is the Holy Grail? So manufacturing a reconstituted wood product from preservative treated wood waste. One of the real challenges we have is in the wine or the grape and the wine growing or wine industry is waste preservative treated vine stakes. They've got a life of maybe 10 or 15 years. At the end of life, they need to be disposed of. It is horribly expensive to dispose of them. So what tends to happen is that at a lot of the farms, there's a stockpile of treated vine posts. But in the circular world, it would be wonderful if we could take those, if we could then reprocess them and make or manufacture preservative treated, fit for purpose particle board using treated waste materials. Now, at the moment, there is treated particle board being made termite proof, for example. They're using virgin chemicals. Wouldn't it be great if we could actually displace those virgin chemicals, wood preservative chemicals, with a recycled material, making sure that the end product is safe and fit for purpose and safe to use, obviously. Okay, next slide. Okay, well that's it. Thank you very much, and looking forward to questions.
Thank you, Simon. You can stay on. So, we've had 4 very different presentations, a couple of reports, some a few ideas, innovative ideas. Simon, your presentation, Rory, yours, looking at different scales. So now I'd like to invite all of our presenters, as well as Joshua Bishop, former WWF, but now with the University of Sydney as an environmental and natural resource economist, Aisha Tulloch from QUT, Laura Hamilton O'Hara from the Living Futures Institute, and Roger Swinburne from Positive Futures Advisory. So Lexi, please remove that slide so then we've got everybody online. Lovely. All right. So Laura, maybe start with you. Be interesting to sort of get your reflections on what you've heard through the presentations and sort of in the work that you're doing. Maybe introduce yourself in the work that you're doing, but also sort of bring some reflections in of how you're thinking about sort of taking kind of the biodiversity built environment story into your work, but also some reflections on what you've heard this morning as well. Thanks.
Sure, thanks Monica, and thanks everyone for your presentations. I'm on Wurundjeri land, travelled down from Wadi Wadi country. So I'm Laura Hamilton O'Hara. I'm the CEO of the Living Future Institute of Australia. And if you can see me now in a hotel room, I've got very much a COVID setup, so that's why my camera is at a weird angle as I'm down traveling. We run a lot of things at the Living Future Institute, including the Living Building Challenge, which is the world's most stringent sustainability standards for buildings and works very much in the regenerative design space. And also something around materials that I'm going to mention in a second, which is the Declare label, which is a transparency label for materials in the built environment. The Living Building Challenge touches on a lot of these themes, and I'll mention all of them, but I just want to mostly focus on materials. Within the Living Building Challenge, there's things like biophilic design, ecology of place, should we even build here? And if the answer is yes, how do we restore it? And what does that look like? We've got habitat exchange. But as I mentioned, we focus a lot on materials through the Declare label. And this kind of reflects a little bit in Lisa's presentation and the idea of circular economy. So in terms of materials, we look at like, how do we source locally? How do we preference salvaged materials, which is touching on a lot of people's presentations? What does third-party certification look like? How do we trust it? But specifically the transparency, or the role of transparency, and that's what the Declare label does. So we focus on worst-in-class chemicals in the built environment and making those very obvious and transparent. And that is for a lot of reasons, including human health for those that are manufacturing it. It's including things like chemicals that bioaccumulate and cause biodiversity impacts or loss down the supply chain, but also things like circular economy. So knowing what's in a product is really important in terms of whether we can use it and how we can use it in its second life. So touching on that. And then the other piece of work, and I know this came through in a question around how do you design for nature within the built environment. And what I'd suggest to that person is having a look at something like biodiversity sensitive urban design, is really thinking about how do we do that. And it's at multiple levels, including planting trees, but what does the understory look like, and what should be there, and what animals and plants and insects should be there in the first place. So designing for those guys, like really specifically getting into the detail. There's lots of poles in cities. What could we use poles as an analogous habitat for? There's plenty of things that use nest boxes, for example, but also kind of connecting those corridors. So for whoever's interested in like more work on that, biodiversity sensitive urban design is a great little resource for you to look into.
Thank you, Laura. Speakers, there's quite a few questions in the chat and in the Q&A. Feel free to jump in there. Simon, there's probably a few there for you, and thank you, Rory, for responding to some of those questions. So I'm going to turn to Joshua now. So what are your reflections on the presentations, and how do you see sort of that convergence between net zero and biodiversity coming together in the built environment?
Thanks, Monica. Thanks, everybody. I'm coming at you from Gadigal country on the part of the Eora Nation. So I really enjoyed the presentations. I think there is some common themes that come out. The links between climate sensitive or low carbon and nature positive, I think those are increasingly clear, and people are starting to see how we can achieve both goals, better outcomes for nature with reduced emissions. But one thing that really struck me from a couple of the presentations, Lisa, for example, also Rory Hunter, is the appeal to systems thinking and the need to take an integrated approach to how we look at buildings. I mean, we know that buildings are incredibly complex machines for living, and they sit within a built environment that includes infrastructure and other features of the places where we live. So there's huge complexity, and yet we often break things down just for simplicity so that we can manage without having our minds boggled. But I do think that taking an integrated systems approach is a common thread in all of these presentations and in all of the reports that we've been talking about. And that requires, among other things, changes in the way we train people coming up in the building and construction industry, and it requires changes in the cultures of the organizations that are responsible for delivering built forms in the built environment. I'll stop there, but I don't know if any of my co-authors want to jump in here. Maybe I'll come back on the issue of cost, because that was another common thread through the presentations and through the questions, is how do you calculate the return on investment? How do you make this profitable? But we'll maybe come back to that.
All right, we might do that. So thanks, Josh. So Aisha, it'd be nice for you to introduce yourself and in the context of the work that you're doing and the report as a co-author, but also what your reflections are and what you've heard from the presentations, please.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I hope you can hear me okay.
No problem.
Yeah, great. Yeah, look, I think Josh makes a really good point, and it's something that I have thought a lot about, the fact that, biodiversity, nature, doesn't neatly follow jurisdictional boundaries. The impacts of developments of buildings, they're cumulative. They're not just additive. We can't just sort of add them up and assume that the sum is just what their parts are. So we need to really be thinking about changing our thinking to the whole landscapes, whole systems, not just individual developments, individual buildings. We can't achieve nature positive or nature recovery through only offsets or only localized innovations, as amazing as they may be. So thinking about, connecting, between people, between cities, between designers, and really thinking innovatively about how can we connect landscapes, connect urbanscapes in a way that we can truly recover nature, in addition to or above the concerns that we have about the climate and reducing carbon.
Okay, thank you, Aisha. So Roger, over to you. It'd be great to for your reflections on what you've heard this morning, and maybe bring it back to thinking about that high value resource recovery for some of the materials that go into the built environment as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Monica. Look, it's great to see the launch of the paper that Megan and put out, the outside buildings. I think that the area of focus at the moment globally has just become very nature oriented, which is great. So I run a company called Positive Futures Advisory. I've been working in sustainability for over 25 years, but I take very much a systems approach to that sustainability component. I've worked on major property, infrastructure and policy programs, but I do see sustainability as a systems problem, and nature is that ultimate kind of complexity that sits around that. I think for me, I think one of the key challenges, and I think we're solving for carbon. We're trying really hard to solve for carbon, and then we're looking at nature as, okay, that's the next problem. They're very different problems, and they're defined very differently. And I think the subjectivity of nature and how we kind of target solutions on that is going to be one of our challenges of how what is the value and how do we value it. I've been looking at sort of what is the intrinsic value of nature, what is the instrumental value of nature, and what is the relational value of nature. What I mean by the intrinsic value of nature is the value of nature for nature. So it's just it's in its own existence. It's really where the biodiversity challenge is. The instrumental value is the value of the resources or the ecosystem services of which nature provides to us. So that's the intrinsic. But the one that gets really complex, I think, is the relational value, which is actually the human relationship with nature. And I think that sort of talks about things like the First Nations view nature very differently to other cultures. You've got First Nations thinking around nature, and then you've got English country gardens, which is a different relationship to nature, which is very different from everybody in terms of the biocultural diversity that exists around how we value it and what we value it for. The thing that worries me most about that is that I sort of take that forward and you think in 100 years' time, at the moment, we've already got about 80% of our population lives in cities. We other nature. Nature is outside cities. We are in cities. If we keep othering nature and we think that that's something else, no matter how much we work on the scientific concept of offsetting or dealing with the biodiversity component, if we don't see it as part of us, which is where I think Laura was talking about the kind of living buildings institute around that kind of integrating the system of nature. And when talking about nature, it is not just about biodiversity. It's not just about ecosystem services. It's not just about urban heat. It's about that system. And just coming back to, I guess what Josh was talking about, it's a systems problem, right? Like this is actually quite complex. How do we embrace that complexity and simplify it to create the actions we need to create? I think for me, in terms of that circular economy side, I think that's a huge tool for us to actually recognize the value of material, the value of assets, the invested carbon, the invested nature, the invested social effort that goes into those. How do we maintain that value for as long as possible? And then recognizing that and recirculating that is going to become so important for all of the sustainability components, because as a tool, it seeks to actually close the loop of the system. So I think there's huge opportunities in embracing circular economy in the context of the material and asset cycling. And I think there's a huge challenge in the valuing case. So they're my two kind of quick reflections on the points today.
And I guess sort of reflecting on that and what Lisa said, the cultural barriers and the challenges around the behaviour change is, equally challenging to kind of the technical aspects to try to solve for these complex problems. So Simon, can I invite you please to answer a few of those questions in the Q&A?
I can't see them in the chat. So
they're in the Q&A. So you have to go to the Q&A.
Q&A,
and there's what does rubber wood end of life look like?
Okay, do you want me to answer those now?
If you answer them while you're writing, I'll come back to you. Then that's easier.
Thanks.
All right, so Rory, there's a question here in the Q&A around direct emissions, waste reduction. Can we position CapEx or investments into energy and waste efficiency as having a return on investment? Is there a similar quantification model methodology to show how investing in nature positive and embodied carbons from buildings has a return on investment? And I guess this comes back to some of the research work that you've been doing. There might even be something in the white paper, if you could speak to that, please.
Yeah, so there's a lot of moving parts there. I think at a simplistic level, if you look at who's going to be owning buildings 10, 20, 30 years from now and how they're going to perceive value, what's happened over the last decade in the commercial office space is really a harbinger of what's to come. And so those who didn't invest in sustainable practices 10 years ago are really left with stranded assets now. People don't want to lease them. Companies, employees don't want to work there, and nobody wants to own them. And so a lot of it's risk mitigation. And so rather than putting a dollar value on a certain piece within that broader equation, for example, embodied carbon, the way we look at it is through how do you value the building, and how will you value the building going forward. And a lot of that comes down to terminal cap rate, the operational efficiencies, through cost reduction in energy saving, and ultimately just having a more appealing asset that people want to want to live in. And so it's stickier. You've got a building that ultimately people want to own. And if you think about, well, certainly at the commercial scale that we're at, it's the super funds that will own these. And so if you think about the sort of members that they have and the expectations of those members on the types of assets that they'll want to own, it's the sort of assets that are driving all of these sorts of changes around biodiversity gain, reductions in embodied carbon, and so forth. And so again, I guess that's, we're talking about systems thinking a lot today. I think ultimately it's about just the alignment of interests and how do you weave those together. And if you can do that effectively, then you mitigate future risk, and that's how you can drive the return.
And so do you perceive that there are opportunities, Joshua raised this around the perception around costs. It's going to cost more to do these at a time where we have a housing crisis, or it's going to cost more to move from a linear to a circular economy. We need new innovative models. Can you speak a little bit to that with your experience?
I can. I mean, our projects are 20% more expensive. But right. So when I say we look at it through the lens of value rather than cost, what I mean is, yes, it might be a little bit more expensive to build, but when you look at the whole life cycle of that asset and all the various assumptions that will drive the value, so be it operational efficiencies, look at compressions in terminal cap rates, lease up, reductions in churn, higher occupancies, because it's going to be much cheaper from a utility perspective for the end user, there's a slight rental premium. All of these aspects create value. And so they more than offset that upfront increase in cost. And so really it's just about looking at buildings in a very different way. Rather than saying, how can we build them as cheaply as we possibly can? We look at it and say, how can we build the most resilient asset that we can? Because by thinking about what the market will expect 10, 20, 30 years from now, if you can design and build for that, then that's how you can generate the return.
Yes, so I think you've answered that for Rob Kilgore as well, who's saying, how do entities like Model propose pushing developments to approach long life, low maintenance outcomes, also for public infrastructure there as well. All right, well, thanks very much, Rory. I know you have other commitments to go to, so really appreciate you sharing that. And if you've got you've shared your resources in the chat as well, and we can include that in our emails. Okay, thank you very much. So I guess
Monica, I think Josh and I would love to sort of respond a little bit to Rory and those other comments on costs.
Yes, I was just about to come to that. So why don't I leave that to you to talk?
So you go first, Josh.
Sure. Okay. So yeah, I think probably it's a truism that a lot of these approaches are perceived as prohibitive from a cost perspective currently, and Rory just admitted as much, 20% higher cost to deliver their projects. So in the short run, I think what we're looking at, and it reminds me of the early stages of renewable energy and low carbon. We're looking at trying to segment the market and find those customers who are prepared to pay a premium for a higher quality, higher value building or project. Long term, though, I think we've also heard from Simon that there's room for innovation that can bring costs down. And just as we've seen in renewable energy markets, which are now more than competitive with fossil fuels, we need to think about and look for nature-based solutions or nature-positive solutions that can deliver better outcomes, higher value, as Rory puts it, at competitive cost. I don't know that we have the answers on all of what is a low-cost, nature-positive delivery system we're building. But I think that's where we should be putting our R&D efforts to try and make these buildings not only better but competitive in cost terms. I'd be interested to hear from others on that. Aisha, I'll turn to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. And look, I work in a field called decision science, and we think a lot about these, cost, reward, return, problems all the time. And, from a simple perspective, like we make these really tough cost benefit decisions all the time. If it's raining outside, we think to ourselves, am I going to take my umbrella? What's the cost to me? Well, I'm going to have to lug it around all day. What's the benefit? Well, I'm going to stay dry. And we can apply that thinking to any kind of decision. And industry does that a lot already, but we just need to think about, well, what is the case, and have really clear ways of making the case for biodiversity. So there is a huge body of evidence showing that connecting nature to people improves economies. It improves people's health and well-being. It lowers medical costs. It provides a whole bunch of services, including climate regulation, what we've heard already, just to name a few things. So, making the biodiversity business case is up to everyone. It's up to the governments, it's up to industry, and it's up to consumers, so that we can weigh up those choices when we're making investment decisions, when we're a house buyer, trying to understand, well, what are the long-term benefits of me buying this piece of construction based on the value in terms of my health, my well-being, and not just the fact that it's got some pretty flowers around it.
Are any other panelists want to speak to this topic?
I think it's also, we know that there's some risks, new business models, changing supply chains. We need innovation. And all of you listening today have a role to play in this to help think about how your business is going to be positioned for the future. But we have to keep remembering that we're heading into a resource and carbon constrained future. And we're running out of natural resources. And if you have a look at the amount of technomass on the planet, it's growing, concrete, aggregate, bricks. And what is commensurately declining is biomass. So, there are externalities we all have to start valuing, and in our own business models as well. So it is a reduced operational costs if we're avoiding virgin use of materials and we can reuse materials. There's increased efficiencies, and enhanced resource security. That's a big one. And that's another reason why Australia's turned to embrace circularity as a policy, official policy, is because 75% of our trading partners are now too. They've got regulations that require materials to be reused and broken down and captured. There's also obviously the environmental protection piece. Reducing waste and promoting reuse helps protect the environment. And then, of course, we've got, the climate change mitigation, which is critical. Half the emissions we need to cut are embodied. And innovation and economic growth are big shifts, are big opportunities, for innovation and design, material science that I talked about before. So how do we create these new jobs and satisfy people? People don't want waste. People want more choices. And that can lead to job creations and new industries. So lots of benefits there, including the social benefits that we just heard from Alicia before on.
Yes, I mean, we heard from Rory in the model, he talked about mental health and the benefits of that. So there are so many co-benefits when you do things well. And I guess from a systems point of view, there are many levers and intervention points to drive that. And we are in the messy middle of this transition to a more regenerative economy. I have a question here, Rick Walters, and I guess, how do we recognise the biodiversity benefits from the inner urban infill that prevents the outer urban sprawl and biodiversity damage? Because there's always going to be that cost benefit. Now, Roger, maybe, you've done a lot of projects, you've advised on a lot of projects. How are you thinking about this issue?
It's an interesting interface, and I think this comes down to what variable and what value, coming back to what I was talking about before, we're trying to address, because in Europe, in terms of the biodiversity impact, a lot of it is seen in the materials space. But in terms of the relational value of ecosystem services, some of the other examples put up around actually bringing nature into place and bringing people into close proximity with that. So there's this interesting relationship between the biodiversity and then the nature question of how people have that relationship with nature. But I think just sort of reflecting a little bit on what Lisa was just talking about, that sort of externalities and valuing the externalities. So for so long, nature and carbon and all these other things have been seen as externalities under the financial modeling. And I think what we're seeing, and this is really interesting to see emerging globally, is that there's an internalization of that. So the finance industries are now looking at nature, they're now looking at carbon, they're now looking at climate as material risks that they're starting to see value on. And when we're looking at the cost of materials in that broader context, I think there's a huge opportunity there, but also they're looking at the cost of waste, and that's being sort of, so all these things are emerging, and I think there is a financial emergence around this. It's not moving fast enough, just to be clear on that, but we are seeing it, and I think because finance used to not see all this stuff, but I think it's becoming much more aware, much more in tune, and I think that's going to change the way we see supply chains. That's the way we see investment. Interesting. I think, Simon, you commented on the shift in plantation timbers because insurance is not there. That's a climate risk area. So people aren't investing in new forestry products because climate risk is there. Insurers are going, I'm not funding and investing in that, and therefore we're not able to play that anymore, which actually increases the need to recycle and use what we've got even more. So there's like this, I guess the evolution of our financial systems and our economic models to take what we, as I said, used to see as externalities as internalities. I think internalities, yeah, stick with me. But that idea, I think, is shifting, and I think it's exciting, but just not moving fast enough.
Any other panelists want to make any other comments?
Yeah,
just a comment on. Sorry, you go.
Thanks, Josh, and sort of picking up on Roger's piece, but also just before that, if anyone hasn't seen I wanted to give you a really solid example, the Daramur House study that Lend-Lease did with UTS and Jungle Fire at the time, where they compared two solar PV systems on identical roofs right next to each other. One had a green roof, one did not. The one with the green roof outperformed the one without a green roof in terms of solar by on average around about 3.5%, but at its most around 30%. The stormwater modeling looked at how actually the green roof helped to manage that. There was an increased level of biodiversity. And in terms of the outperforming, they were able to quantify it, and it was a couple of $1,000s a year that they were saving because that green roof was paired with that solar PV. So one example, but this really, I guess, promising example of how stacked benefits really add up, and how you can think about net zero and biodiversity in the built environment together, and it hits, your net zero target, your biodiversity target, and your resilience targets as well. So a really lovely example if you haven't seen that.
Thank you. And Joshua?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, and this has been pointed out, I think, by one of our speakers, that disclosure is a big part of of getting to where we need to be, and so there's an expectation in the market that project developers will report on a certain range of non-market criteria and indicators. And again, picking up the example from climate change, if we're going to do sensible disclosure, then we need standards and definitions that people understand, and where we're comparing apples with apples. And one of the problems that we've had with the whole nature positive discourse is it's relatively new still. It's only a few years old, and we don't have clear definitions, let alone, well, maybe we have clear definitions, but we don't have clear understanding. We don't have the metrics and indicators that have been derived from that for different industries. I know, Aisha, this is an area you think about a lot, so maybe you can help us out on how close are we to clarity on what is nature positive and how we measure it.
Yeah, look, I think you make a really good point, because I mean, in one way, carbon and emissions are relatively easy to measure. We just put in a couple of figures and we come up with one single number. And I guess the issue with biodiversity is and nature in general, as has been raised by some of the other panelists, is there is very rarely going to be one single number. And there were some really good points in the chat about, and it's not just an economic number. There's a whole lot of other things that go into nature that mean that it is going to be more challenging to, say, measure progress. That being said, there are some very, very good minds around the country right now and around the world working on that and making that the challenge rather than the insurmountable boundary. And there will be a way of measuring it. We may have to think about different ways in different places rather than a single number that we can commodify. It's something that needs to be done, and I think there are a lot of people who understand that nature positive means a net gain in our natural ecological system. So how do we actually achieve that? It's more than just offsetting, it's more than just design. A lot of the time it means we need to directly contribute to it. So that means we need to measure how we have gone about and how we have improved the nature at that particular site and in the landscape. And that could be meaning it's about revegetation, it's about ecological restoration that supports more than just noisy miners, sparrows and blackbirds. Thinking innovatively about how we do things as well as how we measure them, is a way that we can move forward rather than making it a barrier.
Well, the Green Building Council with their Green Star reviews around nature positive will certainly be having some things next year in 2026. They have intentions to really provide some clarity for the commercial building space, which I think will be very exciting to see. Now, Lisa, you've said you want to answer this question from Eloise Doyle. Different challenges for regional versus urban areas, and what are some examples on how to overcome some of those challenges?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really good question. And one of the big things Circular Australia's been pushing on is place-based circularity, which is how do we get the infrastructure in place to actually create these new markets, to collect the resources, safely store them, turn them into new things. So we have been working hard with partners and we're really happy to see in the Australia's circular economy framework that was released last year by the federal government, the important role of place-based circularity. And I think in all our work with partners, this is a big opportunity for regions. We know that Australia is a tiny population across a huge continent, so the economies of scale are challenging. That's why we're seeing the federal governments identify circular opportunities from a state perspective, and because each state can't build all this infrastructure on their own, there needs to be some coordination. And I think that this is a really good chance to do what circularity does well, which is reflect the local environment, the local jobs, the local economies, and how can problems that farmers face or an industry that's located in a region, how can a precinct help amplify and create new jobs? And we know, for example, even with organics waste now mandated, if we use New South Wales as an example, the councils are scratching their heads. They're concerned, where is all this organic waste going to go? And so a couple of the projects that we're working on with partners is to identify sites that may have been used for other things, whether it's mining or manufacturing in the past. How can they be turned into new circular economy hubs and precincts that can sort out organic waste and turn it into fertilizer, but also tackle the big issues that go with that, which is PFAS and other things and contaminants that get in there. So this is a really important consideration. And I think we have our economy, from our perspective, it will become circular. So we've got to work with what we've got. And I think in what we are seeing, which is really optimistic, is that the joint organisations and the regional development investment organisations, whether they're government or privately funded or state funded, are really seeing circular economy as a benefit here. And we have done a report on place-based circularity. So I think this is a really important anchor. It's a really important starting point. Thinking about, if you're starting a business and you need to get waste streams from multiple states. There's major issues. We don't have harmonised legislation at the moment. Sometimes you can't transport that waste stream through borders. So it is really important that we lean in together and we work with our state governments and we work with our councils and local businesses to really create even small but meaningful and impactful projects that are going to help us transition.
Great, thank you, Lisa. And you've kind of touched into one of the questions, I think it was Will Rifkin, about, we're transition brokers as we try and push our way from a very linear economy to a circular economy, but also to nature positive, but hits many other co-benefits. Simon, to you, there's a few questions in the chat on specific details, but I guess, what are you seeing as the trends in your industry, and what role are you sort of taking to try and be that steward towards a nature positive future?
Look, absolutely. So, so we are a standards development organisation. It's always surprises me how pivotal standards are to so much that we do. We're about to start a new round of standards revision. One of the things with particular focus is around deforestation. So internationally, you might be aware of the European deforestation regulations, which are going to impact on global wood supplies. We need to make sure that our Australian standards, New Zealand standards, are as strong as they possibly can be. As a standards developer, we need to keep pace with changing community attitudes. And I think, and one thing we will be doing is ramping up or focusing or making it easier to participate in the circular economy.
Good. I hope somebody, takes the ideas from the presentation today, and great to hear that, you're revising the standards process as well. Wonderful. So thank you very much. Megan, over to you. I guess, how has working on this project changed your approach as a professional and, and in terms of the work that you are doing currently?
Wow, I didn't expect that one. As a professional, I'm not quite in the space at the moment, apart from doing this on the side. So I think the idea is, what do we do next? Probably. We were so fixated on looking at this really big problem and breaking it down and sort of looking at all the pieces of the pie and figuring out where are the sort of entry points to make things better. And as big and complex as the problem is, the solution is itself also big and complex. So I think, where are the opportunities there? Absolutely. The circular economy is an excellent way forward because it is 100% necessary, especially since resources are going to be declining. There is no way around that. And I think also the potential of existing buildings. We do touch a little bit on that in our report as well, about how do we tackle the building stock that we have, which is just sitting there waiting for a better life, I think. So, it's conversations with the right people and starting efforts that wherever that entry point may be, if you have that capacity in your profession and your role, do that. If not, find somebody else and start that conversation with them, because it's the transdisciplinary approach. Yeah.
Thank you. Joshua, to you, what's your sort of sense of where things are going to be heading here?
All right. We're in the midst of an election campaign. The current government, as you all know, has a Future Made in Australia Innovation Fund. I think it's about 1.7 billion, but it's all renewable energy and clean tech. Maybe we should be proposing a Future Built in Australia Innovation Fund that really tackles the built environment and nature positive altogether, tackling the climate crisis, housing crisis, mental health crisis. I think that's sort of short term. Long term, I'd say a plea, everybody read our report. We've got 27 different recommendations. They're all important. If I had to single out one action, it would be invest in how do we integrate nature into educational and training programs? How do we make sure the next generation of people coming through into this industry are really up to speed on integrating nature into buildings. So that's architecture, engineering, planning, and doing all of that in partnership with Indigenous knowledge holders.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Joshua. And Aisha, to you, what's your, I mean, you're in a university, so you are one of those educators, educating people coming through. I mean, what's your sort of sense of where we're at and what we need to do to shift the system?
Yeah, look, I thoroughly agree with Josh. And I mentioned this before, it comes from consumers as well as from the top down. And, one of the ways that we can show the value of biodiversity to consumers is by making more of these connections between our urban developments and nature, showing people through our design and through our practice about what the benefits are. I mean, that's really how, we can change people's minds. We can't just tell them. They need to live it and they need to experience it.
Yes, thank you, Aisha. Very much that cultural change approach. Roger, and to you and your final comments, what do you sort of take from this conversation, and what you think we need to do to really drive that kind of change forward as practitioners in this field?
Yeah, I think, look, a lot of it, and it's been sort of reflected on, but I think obviously taking a systems thinking approach to what we do, but I think for me, it's valuing what we have, recognizing the embodied carbon, the embodied nature, the embodied social effort, the embodied economic and financial effort in what we've got in play before we go too quickly to new. I think that's a really important component, because that values the carbon, that values the nature. I think for me, it's really looking at then taking that into a productivity lens, which is effectively internalizing those externalities. So taking those into the account when we're looking at our decision making and our financial decision making, as well as our sustainability decision making. So they're probably the two that I think for me are most important, which is really just valuing what we've got.
Absolutely. And Laura, some final sort of comments as a panelist?
I think just touching on what Megan said, there are plenty of ways to act. There are lots of pies to be broken up into pieces and do. There's something all of us can do. Maybe we're not all building buildings, but a lot of people are specifying materials or doing something at a smaller scale, and biodiversity can be considered at every single decision. So not only is there an impact, but there's a huge opportunity even in the smallest decisions. So don't forget about it.
Great. Thank you, Laura. So we've heard, from our various speakers and panelists, the importance of systems thinking and, how do we drive change? We have Joshua, we're all going to go down to Canberra and advocate for a future built in Australia. And at the same time, Lisa, taking on one of the recommendations out of your report on a Circular Economy Act, I think, is something that I would certainly like to see in the next term of Parliament, and more focus on kind of the metrics. How do we actually value nature in a very specific way, and making sure that we protect our ecosystems, recognizing that we are nature, we are one with nature, and we rely, both for many reasons on the nature around us. So I really appreciate the effort that our speakers and panelists have put in to putting this event for our MECLA community. We do have some more events coming up over the next few weeks if you want to go onto the MECLA website. And if you have an ability to support us financially in the work that we do, we always welcome that. And the strength of MECLA comes from the strength of our network and the people who are involved, and we are, very much value the collaboration right across the built environment to be able to make these opportunities happen. So really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And Walawani again, safe journey on your next part of your day, and thank you very much. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Monica.
Monica.